Good morning, everyone. Today we're working through the Sermon on the Mount. We continue our series looking at Jesus' radical wisdom for how we live in the world and honour him with our lives. Today we're looking at the greatest commandments, to love God and to love our neighbour. When Jesus asked, what is the greatest commandment? He makes this quote from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. You ought to love God, the Lord your God, and to love your neighbour as yourself. Here in this passage in Matthew, he reminds us that we are to love our neighbour, and sometimes our neighbour is also our enemy. Let me read for you Matthew 5, verses 43 to 48. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Before we have a look at what enemy love looks like, let me just make a comment about what it isn't. Just like the last devotions Travis did about turning the other cheek, it's not calling us to put ourselves in a situation of serious harm. It's not calling us to forget about the harm done to us, or to think that this harm doesn't matter to God. When we love our enemies, we're not called necessarily to put ourselves or others in places of harm, and we're not to think that God has forgotten the harm that our enemies have done to us and to others. But we are called to love them. In loving our enemy, we demonstrate our position as children of God. This is our motivation. We remember who we have become. And this enables us to love our neighbour, and sometimes our neighbour who is our enemy. It says in verse 45 that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. We love each other and love our enemies because God first loved us. Let me read from Romans 5, 8 through 10, just quickly. Well-known verses that remind us of why we have this love and why we're called to love our enemy. Romans 5, verse 8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Our love for God and our love for our neighbour, including our enemy, stems from this, compelled by this, that we were all enemies of God, and yet God demonstrated radical self-sacrificial love so that we might have new lives, forgiveness of sins, and reconciliation with him. When we come to Matthew 5 and think about love of enemy and praying for those who persecute us, I wonder if you're reminded of people in your own life. People who have caused you harm, people who have distanced themselves from you, people who do not want your best. This passage asks us to think about how we might demonstrate God's self-sacrificial love. It's not asking us again to put ourselves in places of harm, not asking us to think that God has forgotten the injustice. But it is asking us to think about how we demonstrate tangibly to these people the love of God, how we model God's own love to us in his Son. A wonderful opportunity to be perfect like our Heavenly Father is perfect. A wonderful opportunity to share God's love with someone else. It's radical. It's incredibly difficult. And this is what we're called to do. We're called to be God's children and to love God, love our neighbour, even when our neighbour is our enemy.